Colleagues, I have a confession. My great-grandfather was a traitor. As difficult as it is for me to say. He actually was a foot soldier in the Confederate Army of the Confederate States. I had another one who was also a Confederate soldier who passed away at Fredericksburg. Now, the word traitor for me, in a family sense, given my military background, is a tough word for me to say and certainly to understand because it's completely different from my understanding growing up. And I certainly didn't think about that, and we certainly didn't talk in those terms. But thinking about the current environment in the United States today and the language and the dialogue and the talk about ripping up the United States, which of course is all true, it's an accurate term to describe my family member. And when I think back to my formative years in and out of the South, because of course my relatives were from Georgia, and I, as old as I am, I was paddling around the South in the 1950s, I certainly observed the consequences of racism even at that point in time. The separate restrooms, the separate and labeled water fountains, the signs that said white only as I would get out of a car, whites only as I would get out of a car at a service station. We called them service stations in those days because you actually got service when you got your gas. And my father would take me by the shoulder and he would make sure and point me in what was then perceived to be the right direction because I was then a young white guy. All that had a tremendous impact on me, both then and throughout my life. And I certainly think that my voting record on issues involving racism and discrimination is clear. In fact, it should be crystal clear to anybody but takes a look at it. But I will note that in military training programs later in life, we studied the battles and we studied the strategies of military officers on both sides of that conflict. And there were great strategists, frankly, on both sides. Now, I don't know why about 10 federal military installations across the United States bear the names of Confederate generals, because I certainly wasn't there at the time those names were selected and plastered on the front gate of those places in Virginia and Texas and wherever. But I suspect that those military installations were not named for those Confederate officers, those Confederate generals, because they were racists. But having said all that, and despite my personal family background and the trouble that all of this conversation has created in me internally, it's hard to argue against the resolution put forward by my colleague from Contra Costa in the Bay Area, because we have to remember, when we think about the Confederacy and those battles, and even my great-grandfather, the words that should come to mind are remember, not revere. Remember, not revere. So I will be joining my colleague from Contra Costa in urging an aye vote on this resolution.